get started as people are trickling in here with just a reminder of the etiquette for our virtual seminar. So just to remind you, all audience participants will be muted throughout the seminar, and please don't attempt to turn on your video or share your screen during the talk. There will be an opportunity for the audience to ask live questions at the end of the talk, just like a normal seminar. And once the speaker is finished, you can use the Zoom's raise hand feature to notify the meeting host that you'd like to ask questions. That would notify me. The raised hand feature is located under the reactions tab at the bottom of your Zoom window. And you are invited to turn on your video during the questions portion of the talk. So with that, it is my pleasure today to introduce our seminar speaker, Dr. Bill Sydeman, who is the president and senior scientist at the Farallon Institute, which is a nonprofit science organization that he founded in 2007. And I found out just has about 12 scientists contributing to diverse areas of marine science, and we'll learn a little bit more about that today, I'm sure. He's going to talk to us today about some work that was published last spring in Science, and we're going to learn a little bit more about seabirds and some of the really interesting global work that he has been doing. So with that, I would just like to turn off my video and hand it over to you, Bill. We're so happy to have you with us here today and excited to hear your talk.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I get just a sound check? Is everything okay? Sarah, can you hear me?
Yep, sounds good, looks good.
Very good. All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. These virtual seminars are a way that we get to try to keep in touch with one another during this difficult period that we've been through, and hopefully sometime reasonably soon we'll all be able to get together again and meet in person. One of the things that I was really missing or have been missing is going and visiting with colleagues at universities and other places to talk about research and actually sitting down with people in their offices and learning more about what everybody is working on. So with that, though, I hope that this seminar gives you some idea about some of the work that we've been working on, looking at climate change and in this particular case, ocean stratification, which I'll say a little bit about at the end of the talk, and also the breeding performance of indicator species, which in this case are seabirds. As Sarah mentioned, I'm at the Farallon Institute in Petaluma, California, so just up the road from Moss Landing, a few hours north of San Francisco. So first off, I'd like to acknowledge my principal collaborators in the project that I'm going to describe and the work that I'm going to describe to you today. Sarah Ann Thompson, who was responsible for much of the database work and also analytical work. David Schumann, who is a professor of global change at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia. It is a lovely place, so the name is perfect for it, University of the Sunshine Coast. Brian Hoover, who was a postdoc with me here at Farallon Institute, but is currently a professor at Chapman University in Southern California. And then Marisol Garcia Reyes, who has helped with the oceanography, and she's a coastal oceanographer here at Farallon Institute. There are a whole host of other people that have been involved in the study as well, but we'll get to that towards the end. So what I want to talk about today is the concept of using seabirds as sentinels to changes in global marine ecosystems. There have been a few papers about that recently, but I just highlighted a couple of those right here on this slide. Enriqueta Velarde and colleagues wrote a perspective in Science entitled Seabird Clues to Ecosystem Health a couple of years ago. And then Elliot Hazen and colleagues, we wrote a paper in Frontiers of Ecology and the Environment about marine top predators as climate and ecosystem sentinels. And both of these papers were largely theoretical. They contained some data, but really the idea of using seabirds as sentinels to changes at the global scale was something that needed to be tested, even though I think that we had good evidence that at a local scale that seabirds were very good indicators of changes. But when you think about it from the standpoint of seabirds as sentinels of large marine ecosystems, there's likely to be changes in how species respond to climate, and also the variability in responses, or there may be variability in responses across ecosystems and across ocean domains or ocean regions. So that's sort of the overall background for why we thought doing this would be interesting. And then the other side of course, is that we're living in an era of very extreme climate events. And those extremes are a result of the long-term change, long-term warming that we're seeing, where if we look at a baseline, let's say between 1980 and 2010, the 30-year period, we're seeing more and more times now that we're crossing over into what would have been considered an extreme event, based on that date, based on that baseline. The baseline is also changing, of course. So one of the things that we need to think about is, our new normal is that we would be in extreme conditions all the time unless we thought about how the baseline is changing. So I show here the sea surface temperature anomaly image from the Northeast Pacific during May of 2015. And this is what the blob looked like. I'm sure most of you have heard about the blob. It was named that by Nick Bond, who's an oceanographer at the University of Washington. And you can see here this extremely warm water that stretched from Southern California all the way up into the Gulf of Alaska and in the Aleutian Islands here. And this was the blob. So here we have the May 2015 look at this massive heating event that occurred in our backyard. And this is compared to a baseline of May 2003 to 2013. So a substantial warming event. And this is well documented. This image comes from a cover photograph that was published in Geophysical Research Letters by Chel Gentiman. She's a satellite oceanographer that's here at Farallon Institute as well. Excuse me, let me just make sure my phone doesn't do that again. And anyway, so this is our new normal, that now we're living with these marine heat waves and these massive heating events. And these things don't just go away. And one of the things that I think we've learned is that there are long-term, it takes a long time for this sort of heat to dissipate. And so there can be very long-term consequences to a single marine heat wave event. So what we thought we would do in terms of looking at the use of seabirds as sentinels of ecosystem change is we have a food web that's shown here, which is representative of our ecosystem. And we have observable data, which is climate, shown in the bottom here, up to these observable upper trophic level marine predators. And we know that seabirds and marine mammals and fish have all been observed for a long period of time for various reasons. And so we can study those two things quite easily and put those two things together. But what we don't really know oftentimes is what's going on in these sort of mid to lower trophic levels. For example, what's going on with zooplankton and what's going on with forage fish. But we know that these animals here at the top of the food chain are reliant on things in the middle part of the food chain, so that what we're thinking is that the conceptual approach is that the observable upper trophic level predators can indicate how climate is also affecting the mid-trophic level productivity. And so that's sort of the overall approach and overall assumptions to the work. Now, we know that this is a particularly valid assumption for seabirds because seabird breeding success is determined largely by food availability and prey fields. And these series of images show come from a paper by Curie et al. In 2011, sorry, not 2001, 2011, that was published in Science. What we see here is that across all these different sites and all these different species, that there's a relationship between the abundance of prey and breeding success of birds. And one of the things that is basically true for most of the species or most of the ecosystems is that it's a nonlinear relationship where breeding success changes as a function of prey availability from sort of low levels and then up to high levels, and then there isn't very much of a change once you get up to the highest levels of changes in prey. So one of the examples that I wanted to go over, just as a way of sort of the background, is to look at the effects of climate events on a marine top predator in the North Pacific. This is a paper that was published by John Pyatt and others on the die-off of one of the dominant seabirds in the North Pacific, the common murre. And you can see here, these show the number of murres that were collected along beaches in Alaska and all the way down the West Coast in the winter of 2015. About 62,000 birds were collected, which represented maybe 500,000 birds that had been affected. And this was related back to the blob, the marine heat wave at that time. What you can see here is that this marine heat wave was related to regional variability in mass mortality of murres. So this is the kind of thing that we thought would lead us to good indications of seabird climate relationships on the global scale. And then the details of that, the mechanism was that warming caused changes in prey accessibility. In other words, the prey went deeper. Also, the quantity and quality of the prey. And importantly, there was another side of this mechanism that we thought was very important in that it altered the trophic interactions. There was more top-down effect due to temperature-related increases in predatory fish metabolism. And so they ate a lot more of the forage fish, and hence that caused food stress for the birds and led to their mortality. So this is the kind of example of a detailed study that we thought would support our concept of using seabirds as sentinels on the global scale. So another approach to our global ecology studies of seabirds is that we wanted to look at seabird biodiversity. And in this, we mean variation in life history traits to understand different potential trophic mechanisms. And so one of the things that we sought to do was to compare species responses across the globe. And so we compared how piscivorous fish-eating seabirds were doing with planktivorous birds. We also compared the trends in their breeding success for surface and subsurface foraging. And a third thing that we didn't really get into in the paper, although we talked about it before we started to do this, was to look at how birds moved and used the seascapes. So this was just, taking advantage of the variation in seabirds to try to understand more about how they could be used as sentinels. So as I mentioned just earlier, seabirds use plankton and also a wide variety of forage fish primarily from the epipelagic domain, but also for shallow waters. And so one of the things that we could be looking at is these changes in these mid-trophic level or mid-water column forage fishes. These are anchovies that are actually being shunted out of the water by a humpback whale. But these are pigeon guillemots that are holding benthic fish. These are sculpins. So it's not just your sort of typical forage fish that we thought that would be indicative of changes here, but other things like these sublittoral fishes as well. So variation in use of the epipelagic domain. Again, we've compared birds that were foraging at relatively shallow depths, such as cormorants and puffins even, with birds that could forage at depth. These common murres going down to about 200 meters. This is a gannet that could dive down to about 50 to 70 meters or so. And of course, some of the deepest diving birds are penguins, emperor penguins and king penguins that could go down to 400 to 500 meters, something like that. So by comparing all these different animals and their life history traits, we hope we would gain some insight into the changes in the marine environment that we were tracking by the birds' differences in breeding success. And of course, birds are using different aspects of the air-sea ecotone as well, from neritic to pelagic habitats. And again, we didn't really get into this, but this is something to be done in the future. So to move on to some of the results, what I want to do first is go through a series of slides that talk about variation in climate change that have been observed. And so I'm going to talk about ocean warming events, and then marine heat waves, and then end with some information about other human impacts. So the panel on the left shows changes in this case, the rate of ocean warming and the velocity of ocean warming. So this is a spatial measurement of changes in isotherms through time. And then the smooth histograms on the right show the differences that we've seen over the last 50 years in the rates of warming between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. And I should say, I forgot to say this earlier, that one of the things that we thought would be good to do, start with a global analysis, is to actually look at differences between hemispheres, because we knew there were these differences between hemispheres in warming and other factors, but they'd never been looked at and then related back to some sort of a biological variable like seabird breeding success. So you can see here the rate of warming in the northern hemisphere, which is shown by the purple histogram, and the rate of warming in the southern hemisphere, which is the light green. The northern hemisphere, the rate of warming is quite a bit larger than it is for the southern hemisphere. And again, that's in degrees C per decade. If you look at, if you look at the velocity of ocean warming, you get the same sort of data, but spatially it's very different. I mean, here you can see that the ocean warming is really concentrated in the northern hemisphere. When you look at velocity of ocean warming, that shift in isotherms, we see that most of that is occurring in tropical regions. But again, if you just compare the northern hemisphere, the rates of shifting of isotherms with the southern hemisphere, that's been much greater in the northern hemisphere than it is in the southern hemisphere. So marine heat waves, we look through the same sort of analysis and comparing hemispheric differences in marine heat waves. The first panel, panel E, shows the rate of change in the number of marine heat wave days. And the bottom panel here is panel G, showing the rate of change in cumulative marine heat wave intensity. And again, the smooth histograms on the right-hand side showing in purple what's going on in the northern hemisphere as opposed to what's going on in the southern hemisphere. So obviously a much greater rate of change in the number of marine heat wave days in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere. And the same thing going on with the intensity of the marine heat waves. And in fact, this variable is even more substantial differences between the hemispheres, where we have much greater marine heat wave intensity in the northern hemisphere than we do in the southern hemisphere. And I should also mention here, we have these different sites where we've studied seabirds in both hemispheres, which I'll get to in a moment. And so for those of you that are wondering what are these sites, these are the data that correspond to the individual study sites. But I don't think we need to go over that in detail, but that's what that means. So the third thing I wanted to talk about is an overall ocean impacts indicator that has been developed by Ben Halpern et al. And published in a series of papers, but the latest one is in 2019. And Ben and his colleagues compiled all this information and then crunched it using some sort of a data reduction analysis. Can't remember exactly what they used right now, but they looked at changes in SST, which again, that's what we just went over, but also changes in ocean acidification and sea level rise. They also looked at changes in fishing effort and fish removals. So by artisanal fisheries as well as commercial fisheries and pelagic fisheries, for example, most of those types of fisheries on anchovy and sardine and krill in the Antarctic. They also looked at information about pollution, nutrient pollution, other organic chemical pollution, runoff, and also modeled human populations in these areas to come up with this overall ocean impacts indicator. So this is really a synthesis of both climate and other factors. So very useful when trying to look at things on a global scale. And just going back to our previous view of the world, the top is the cumulative human impact index that was developed by Halpern et al. Again, in the northern hemisphere, shown by the purple, southern hemisphere shown by the green. And you can see very clearly that the level of human impacts, not surprisingly at all, in the northern hemisphere, shown by this red area, is much greater than it is in the southern hemisphere. But the interesting thing here is that if you look at the rate of change in the cumulative human impact index over the period of 2003 to 2013, there's almost no difference between hemispheres. The rate of change has been about the same, but you can see here in the southern hemisphere a lot more red, which is indicative of a lot more growing human impacts based on the variables that Ben put together in those different locations there. So while the overall impact of humans on marine ecosystems is much greater in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere is starting to catch up, which is kind of an unfortunate way of looking at it. So we wanted to then look at how do these changes, be they climate-related changes or other changes in the marine ecosystems, affect seabird breeding success. And we compiled a data set of 46 sites that were inclusive of 66 species, included 122 time series, which represented actually about 3,500 individual data points. And you can see here on the map where these seabird study sites were located. We had collaborators and data contributors from Japan, Norway, Britain, Germany, of course, California, Alaska, Hawaii. We'll also have information from Argentina, the Antarctic Peninsula, South Africa, the southern Indian Ocean, Western Australia, Eastern Australia, and also in quite a bit of information coming from New Zealand. So we put together all these time series and then looked at what the trends in breeding success were like based on the hemispheric variability in climate and other human impacts that we'd established. And one of the things that is quite apparent, or should be quite apparent, is that we're missing a lot of information from the tropics. There just isn't as much data from the tropics as there is from mid to higher latitudes. And so that's one of the deficiencies of this study is that we really don't have information from a large area of the world's oceans that we'd like to have information on. A little bit about the data set here. The seabird data that we looked at, there's definitely more data in the north coming from the northern hemisphere, but there are actually quite similar increases in data richness through time. So this shows the cumulative proportion of observations in both the northern and the southern hemisphere, and these lines become somewhat indistinguishable as you go through time. But you can see here that we do have, as would be expected, more data overall that comes from the northern hemisphere, but southern hemisphere, but they're growing at relatively similar rates in terms of available data. Okay, so this is the main results slide on hemispheric differences in seabird breeding success. And I mentioned earlier that we subdivided the data based on differences in seabird life histories. The data was analyzed using generalized linear mixed models. Each time series was used as a random effect. And then we had the main effects being hemisphere and year, as well as these factors which are shown here. Again, whether the seabird species was largely planktivorous or it's largely omnivorous or piscivorous, and then also foraging depth, those that fed primarily at the surface versus those that fed primarily at the subsurface. And we use the same color coding here. So purple indicates the northern hemisphere and green indicates the southern hemisphere. So if we looked at planktivores in terms of their normalized breeding productivity, so this is just taking that mean breeding productivity or the annual breeding productivity per site and dividing it by the standard deviation to normalize it so that we can compare these different species. We can see that planktivorous species overall, or averaging across all the planktivores that we have in the northern hemisphere, there's actually been a positive trend in breeding success through time, whereas planktivores in the southern hemisphere, there's been a slight decline, but neither of these trends are actually significant. However, once we start to look at species that feed on fish, we get somewhat of a different story. In both the northern hemisphere and in the southern hemisphere, omnivorous species, in other words, those that feed on plankton and fish, their overall average breeding success has been declining by about 25% through time over this period from about 1950 to the present. And again, this is synthesizing all these different species from all these different locations. And then if you look at what's been going on with species that are obligate piscivores, so these are species that feed just on fish, we get a significant decline in the breeding success of fish eaters in the northern hemisphere and an increase in breeding success in the southern hemisphere. So again, these hemispheric differences in climate, it does seem that the birds are tracking some of those differences in their breeding success. The other thing that we looked at was the probability of breeding failure. And we wanted to look at this variable because of the increase in marine heat waves. And we assumed that the increase in marine heat waves would lead to not just changes in mean breeding success, but actually changes in whether or not they were successful at all. And so we divided the data sort of the same way. We had planktivores, omnivores, and piscivores. And shown here is the probability of breeding failure through time, plus or minus a standard error. And in this case, the model also came out with an indication that surface and subsurface foragers we're doing things differently. And let me just start with the subsurface. Again, the green is the southern hemisphere, and the purple, which you can't really even see here, is the northern hemisphere. So for planktivorous species, there's a slight non-significant increase in the rate of breeding failure for the southern hemisphere and no change in the northern hemisphere, which would also correspond with the long-term change in breeding success for planktivores. If you look at the omnivorous species, again, those are feeding on both fish and plankton, there was a substantial, significant increase in the rate of breeding failure that tracks about to the year 2000 in the northern hemisphere, and a corresponding change in the southern hemisphere. I mean, no change in the southern hemisphere, but this change in the northern hemisphere was much greater for surface foraging species than subsurface foraging species. The same sort of pattern for the piscivores, but it seems to have been going on for a longer period of time. There was an increase in the rate of breeding failure for both surface and subsurface foraging piscivores, but the surface foragers, the rate of change was much greater than the rate of change for the subsurface. So this leads to the following conclusions about seabirds as sentinels of changes, of global change. First of all, we seem to, maybe not unexpectedly, be having a lot more trouble in the north, but we see that we also have opportunity in the south. So the news is not all bad. The breeding success and the rate of breeding failure, the breeding success is declining more rapidly in the northern hemisphere, where human impacts, including climate change, rates of ocean warming, increasing marine heat waves are greatest. The rate of breeding failure is also increasing, especially for surface foraging and fish-eating species in the northern hemisphere, and this corresponds to an increase in the frequency of marine heat waves and the amplitude of marine heat wave. And it also is corresponds with increases in ocean stratification. Now we need to test this directly, but since warming leads to increasing stratification, that's a primary mechanism which we think is affecting that upper water column. Excuse me. So we think that it is about food. The bird's prey base is playing a big role in these changes in global breeding success of birds. The analysis suggests that there's a decline in epipelagic productivity, particularly so the productivity of fish and plankton in the upper water column. Again, this is something that needs to be tested more directly than what we did in this paper, but that is what it's suggesting, is that upper water productivity is changing. Southern hemisphere seabirds are in much better shape, and that leads to a comment that there may be opportunity for longer term strategic management opportunities, such as large-scale marine protected areas, to make sure that the changes that we've seen in the northern hemisphere do not happen in the southern hemisphere. As mentioned by Sarah in my introduction, this work was published in Science on May 28, 2021. And in addition to the people that I mentioned earlier today, there were dozens of data contributors from all over the world, and you can see the list of co-authors there. It was kind of an amazing coming together of all these people working together to try to come up with an understanding of what was going on with seabird breeding success on the global scale. I mentioned earlier that stratification really needs to be tested more thoroughly. And this figure shows seasonal variability in stratification index, which we developed using the European Glories model. And I just wanted to point out that the seabird breeding seasons in the Northern Hemisphere generally occurring during this period of the summertime period of June, July, and August. And you can see here that of all these seasons, this is when seasonal stratification, not surprisingly, given the warming of the ocean that takes place during that season, is also correspondingly greatest. And so we'll be looking at this hopefully in the future and trying to relate stratification directly to seabird breeding success, which has been done on the local scale, but nothing on the scale of looking at what's happening by hemisphere or globally. Finally, I just want to end with some comments about seabirds as sentinels. Overall, I think it's very promising, and we're making progress in this field. But there really are lots of questions that remain about which species and species groups are best for sensing different parts of complex marine ecosystems. Now we have this great advantage in that there's high biodiversity amongst seabirds. And so we could have a puffin indicating something about these fish, and this auklet indicating something about these krill. But we need more and more redundancy. We need to find more examples of species that can be put together into species groups, such as what we've tried to do with looking at both planktivores and piscivores, and also those that are feeding on the surface and subsurface, and put those together. But we think we're on the right track here. We just have to do more of this and gain a little more insight into what the birds are actually indicating. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
I will be the representative. Thank you so much, Bill, for that wonderful presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and moderate the Q&A. So if you can maybe stop share.
Stop share. There we go. Okay.
Perfect. So now we're all up in the panel. And if anyone has a question, go ahead and use that raise hand feature. And in the meantime, while people are thinking, I will go ahead and ask a question. So what do you think is the most important piece of missing data, or an important piece of missing data to get a higher resolution to use seabirds in this way as an ecosystem indicator? Do you think like an indicator of seabird health or diet?
Yeah, I mean, we have, there are lots of other variables that are available that are seabird data. And I think the one that is maybe most promising to integrate that we have available would be seabird diet. There has been a meta-analysis of seabird phenology globally, and that's a really tricky variable to work with. Phenology is the study of timing events, and so I mean, people have tried that, but I think a synthesis of the dietary data would answer a lot of questions about, what's going on with the prey use. It doesn't necessarily tell you exactly everything about prey abundance or the prey fields that the birds are experiencing, but it would tell you a lot about the changes in how they're using prey over time. So I'd say diet, yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
I see Tom has his hand raised. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, thank you for a great talk. Very interesting study. You mentioned that the idea of a decline in epipelagic productivity, and I was wondering if that's something that you have plans to test, and what it would take to test that. You mentioned diet before, but like you said, that doesn't account for abundance necessarily.
Right. We do have plans. it's a matter of the funding gods being being cooperative. And so one of the things that we would like to do is take that model that we have of stratification, which also includes other variables on primary productivity, and look at putting those things together so that we would have more of a complete picture of bottom-up changes in different environments and in different locations, and try to get a better handle on that. One of the real limitations, and I thought about answering Sarah's question with this answer, was we really lack a lot of information on on zooplankton and fish at this particular scale. Now there are locations where there is some good data. So you could do a comparative study of sort of bottom-up dynamics from, let's say, stratification to seabird breeding success in probably maybe 10 or 12 of the sites that we have compiled. And that would be another really interesting thing to do. And you could go probably, I mean, we'd be missing data on certain trophic levels in certain locations, but that would be a very interesting thing to do. It would be just a much smaller sample of available sites that you can use to look at these sorts of things. But to get at these mechanisms, we're not going to be able to be fully global.
Yeah. So would the Eastern Pacific then be I guess, one good test bed for trying to look at these mechanisms? Is that where you might have a lot of data?
Eastern Pacific is good. The California current is good. South Africa is very good. Some places in the Antarctic have excellent data across traffic levels. Actually, the Japanese data set is really well positioned to be able to do that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll keep my eyes peeled for another raised hand in case there's a question that comes in while I'm asking this question, which might seem a little bit out of left field, or maybe there might not be an easy answer for this, but are there agents of kind of top-down control on seabirds themselves? Like if you think of like pathogens or something that might impact the way that we view them as ecosystem indicators? Is that something that you think about or consider?
Yeah, it's definitely something that we consider. There are other things that are controlling, seabirds in general. When you look at, let's say, abundance, die-offs happen for a lot of different reasons. It's not all food related. And so harmful algal blooms, pollution events. I mean, you can come up with a number of different things when you're looking at abundance. Now, we chose to look at breeding success because breeding success is so highly tied to food. And there are other things that come to play, like density dependent population mechanisms and things like that. But in terms of breeding success, at least pathogens probably wouldn't play a large role at this scale, I think. Harmful algal blooms, though, there could be, again, it would be more regional or more local. As most of these things, I think, when you think about pollution events or something else, it's you wouldn't see patterns on a global or near global scale. But we do think about these things, particularly when we're thinking about changes in the abundance of bird populations. And that's where it really comes to play. And I think even this idea about seabird die-offs and how they're related to climate and some of the things that I talked about, and those are the kinds of variables where some of these other factors might really play a big role.
Thank you. All right, so I don't see any other raised hands at the moment, so we'll just go ahead and thank you, Bill, again for a wonderful seminar and for tolerating these technical difficulties and rolling with it. And thanks everyone for coming. Can give a round of applause, and hope to see you in person again at some point.
All right, thank you all very much for coming, and that was very enjoyable, and yeah, you have to roll with the punches with these virtual seminars. Things go off on you. So thank you.